On a sun-scorched plain where banners fluttered and drums thundered, a warrior named Arjuna felt his hands tremble and his heart close. In that instant, he faced a paradox that has haunted humans for millennia: how to fight when the cost is personal and the future depends on unknown outcomes. The Bhagavad Gita begins in this raw human confusion and then unfolds like a map for action without clinging to results. This opening scene is not only a historic moment, but also a psychological mirror reflecting modern dilemmas in boardrooms, hospitals, and family rooms. When outcomes feel uncertain and stakes feel personal, every modern person has stood where Arjuna stood and asked whether action is possible without attachment to how things turn out. The Mahabharata's Great War provides the literal backdrop, but the Gita speaks in metaphor as much as history, addressing inner wars that rage within every individual. Arjuna represents anyone frozen by doubt, while Krishna becomes both guide and revelation, pointing toward a different kind of agency than simple desire. Driven action, the battlefield becomes the interior stage where duty, fear, identity, and freedom confront each other in stark terms. Understanding the context matters because the Gita was offered as counsel for action under extreme moral stress, not as an abstract treatise removed from human life. The conversations that follow are practical, poetic, and paradoxical, teaching ways to act ethically while preserving inner clarity and balance even when outcomes remain uncertain. Krishna steps into Arjuna's crisis as a charioteer who speaks with the authority of a teacher and the tenderness of a friend, and his voice reframes the entire moment. He tells Arjuna that the real war is not outside, but within, where doubt and identification with the temporary self decide every action. This teaching transforms the battlefield into a classroom and makes duty a path toward freedom rather than merely an obligation. Krishna's presence introduces a crucial idea: wisdom that liberates action from fear depends on precise self-knowledge and steady perspective, not on retreat from responsibility. The relationship between teacher and seeker in the Gita shows how guidance can help recalibrate intention, focus energy, and disentangle work from obsessive attachment to particular outcomes. The Gita presents karma yoga as a core path, a way of acting selflessly with dedication but without clinging to results. And this concept shakes the foundations of ordinary motivation, rather than performing actions for reward, recognition, or avoidance of pain. The practitioner learns to do what is right because it aligns with duty and truth. Karma yoga demands discipline of the will and clarity of intention, so action becomes a form of service instead of a calculated trade. When action is reframed as service, the actor's identity begins to shift away from fragile ego needs and toward a steadier center of purpose. This inner reorientation does not remove responsibility or diminish effort. It simply frees the person to invest full energy without letting future outcomes enslave present stability. Krishna offers short, piercing maxims that anchor karma yoga into practice, including the famous instruction to act but remain unattached to the fruits of action. He implores Arjuna to perform his duty without craving the rewards that usually drive human toil. And this is not ascetic indifference, but disciplined engagement. The verses read like a manual for steady action. Focus on the task, offer your efforts without demand, and accept whatever follows with equanimity. These teachings are deceptively simple because they require repeated mental training to embody, not merely intellectual assent to a statement. Repetition, ritual, and ethical discipline help create a character that can act efficiently under pressure while remaining emotionally steady when results deviate from expectation. Attachment begins as a small knot around a desire, and it grows into a web that distorts perception and enslaves action to fear of loss or craving for gain. The Gita diagnoses attachment as the root of suffering because it binds the self to outcomes and prevents clear action motivated by duty. Krishna explains that when action is driven by attachment, it builds more bondage, while action performed with detachment leads to clarity and inner freedom. Psychologically, attachment fuels constant rumination and reactive behavior. And the Gita offers an alternative by teaching how to separate intention from result while remaining morally engaged. This psychological reframe reduces anxiety, preserves ethical grounding, and allows for care without clinging to how things ultimately turn out. A central metaphysical claim of the Gita is the distinction between the transient body and the eternal self, called the Atman. And this distinction frees action from identity-based anxiety. Krishna teaches that the self is not the doer in the conventional sense tied to results. Rather, it is the witness that enables action without being consumed by its fruits. Recognizing a deeper, unchanging identity alters motivation and allows the agent to operate from a stable inner ground. This ontological shift is not metaphysical escapism, but functional psychology. If one identifies with the permanent witness, rather than the fluctuating ego, then praise and blame cease to destabilize action. In practical terms, such self-knowledge provides a foundation for resilience amid success and failure alike. Detachment in the Gita is described as adopting the perspective of the witness who observes changes without becoming absorbed by them, and this mental posture can be cultivated. The witness consciousness allows emotions to arise and pass without reactive entanglement, enabling clearer decision. Making in volatile moments. Living from this vantage does not mean indifference toward results, but rather a refusal to let results determine inner equilibrium. Practically, cultivating witness awareness involves simple practices like tracking breath, labeling emotions, and pausing before responding, which brings space between impulse and action. Those small pauses accumulate and become the difference between a life lived impulsively and a life lived deliberately with detachment at its core. The Gita's model for action relies on intention, duty, and disciplined practice rather than on avoidance or fatalism, and this distinction matters deeply in modern application. When someone acts from duty defined by ethics and responsibility, they can still evaluate consequences and adapt strategies while maintaining inner detachment. This balance between engagement and non-attachment enables effective leadership, compassionate service, and sustainable work without burning out. Applied ethically, the principle means doing the right thing even when success is uncertain, and accepting outcomes without personal devastation if they fail. This creates resilience and fosters a long-term orientation in which learning and integrity trump short-term wins tied to ego satisfaction. People often ask how to make moral choices when duty seems ambiguous or conflicting, and the Gita addresses this through clarity of intention and wise counsel. Krishna instructs Arjuna to act according to his role and dharma, which requires understanding responsibilities rooted in context and capacity. This means that duty is not an abstract universal, but a situated commitment to act rightly within the circumstances one faces. Hence, discerning duty requires reflection, mentorship, and sometimes painful sacrifice. But the Gita insists that action aligned with conscience, not convenience, is the path toward liberation. This ethical framing prevents the misuse of detachment as an excuse for moral passivity and directs action toward accountable engagement. True peace in the Gita is not the absence of activity, but the presence of inner equanimity amid relentless activity, and this paradox is central to its spirituality. Krishna describes a person who remains serene whether praised or blamed, satisfied or dissatisfied, showing that peace is a regulated inner climate rather than a change in external conditions. Cultivating such peace involves a steady practice of self-observation, restraint, and devotion to purpose beyond personal reward. This form of peace is pragmatic and actionable because it reduces the metabolic cost of anxiety and protects decision-making capacity under pressure. Individuals who stabilize their inner state are able to sustain creative effort, respond adaptively to setbacks, and maintain ethical clarity when compromise becomes tempting. The Gita's prescriptions are surprisingly applicable to modern life, where complex systems create ambiguous feedback loops and delayed results, leaving people anxious and reactive, whether in entrepreneurship, medicine, parenting, or activism. Acting without attachment helps individuals persist through uncertainty while retaining moral accountability. Practitioners learn to set process-oriented goals and focus on means rather than obsessing over ends which often remain outside personal control. Real-world examples include doctors staying committed to treatment protocols despite uncertain prognosis, parents loving children without micromanaging outcomes, and activists campaigning tirelessly without guaranteed policy wins. Each example shows how detachment tempered by sustained effort leads to durable contributions without personal disintegration when outcomes shift unexpectedly. It is critical to emphasize that detachment is not indifference or irresponsibility, and the Gita repeatedly warns against misunderstanding this nuance. Acting without attachment still requires wisdom, strategic thinking, and accountability for consequences since actions ripple through families, communities, and ecosystems. Detachment instead changes the quality of engagement, so responsibility is met without self-destruction when outcomes deviate from plans. This balanced approach preserves ethical urgency while preventing emotional burnout and reckless behavior driven by egoic craving for victory or recognition. The Gita thus offers a mature ethic of action that supports sustained contribution across complex social systems. Many modern critics fear that the Gita encourages passivity or acceptance of injustice, and this critique deserves careful response rather than dismissal. The text actually promotes active duty aligned with Dharma, which frequently compels courageous intervention against wrongdoing rather than passive acceptance of harm. Krishna counsels action grounded in wisdom and courage, not complacency or blind submission to fate. When read historically, the Gita inspired numerous leaders and reformers who paired detachment with fierce commitment to justice, showing the teaching's compatibility with social responsibility. The right application of detachment becomes a tool for long-term moral persistence, not a philosophy of avoidance or resignation. From a psychological perspective, acting without attachment reduces stress by limiting rumination and perceived personal threat, and modern neuroscience supports many aspects of this claim. Letting go of hyper-focused outcome dependence lowers cortisol responses and improves prefrontal regulation, enabling clearer thinking under pressure. Training in attention, cognitive reframing, and values-based action builds mental habits that mirror the discipline advocated by the Gita and lead to better performance and well-being. Therapeutic practices like acceptance and commitment therapy echo Gita principles by promoting committed action while reducing fusion with particular thoughts and outcomes. This intersection of ancient wisdom and modern science provides practical tools for cultivating durable focus and emotional stability in demanding environments. Ethics remains central in the Gita because detachment does not absolve one from responsibility for consequences that affect others, and Krishna underscores accountability repeatedly. The teaching requires acting in ways that respect justice and human dignity, and it warns against using detachment to justify selfish aims under the guise of dispassion. A morally attuned practitioner constantly evaluates actions by their impact rather than their convenience for personal peace. Thus, the Gita encourages reflective responsibility where detachment supports long-term ethical commitment rather than short-term escape from moral consequence. This perspective helps bridge spiritual practice with civic virtue and sustainable leadership across institutions. Ritual, discipline, and simple daily practices in the Gita create the scaffold that supports detached action, and these practices are accessible to contemporary seekers. Repetitive disciplines such as focused work, reflective journaling, and brief meditative pauses build the mental muscles necessary for steady engagement under stress. These small forms of tapas, or disciplined effort, prepare the mind to act without collapsing into attachment when outcomes turn unpredictable. Over time, a disciplined life cultivates habits that allow one to respond rather than react, to weigh intentions against consequences, and to remain rooted in purpose rather than in fluctuating external rewards. Ritual and discipline thus function as practical technologies for embodying the Gita's teachings in everyday life. The Gita uses vivid metaphors like seeds, fields, and the river to illuminate how action and detachment relate across time and space, and these images resonate deeply with human intuition. One famous metaphor compares the self to a rider and the body to a chariot, illustrating how wisdom steers action without being dragged by transient desires. These metaphors help translate dense philosophy into practical images remembered easily and applied in the messiness of life. Stories and symbolic language function as cognitive tools that rewire perception, enabling people to internalize difficult ideas through imagery and habit. When metaphors become habitual lenses through which one interprets events, they guide behavior toward detachment without requiring constant intellectual effort. Practically speaking, adopting Gita-inspired practices involves three daily moves: clarify intention, commit to right effort, and release fixation on outcomes, each supported by a short reflective ritual. Clarifying intention means naming the values guiding your actions before you begin, which aligns motivation with purpose rather than ego. Committing to right effort means doing the work skillfully and ethically, while releasing fixation involves a brief end-of-day reflection that acknowledges results without attaching identity to success or failure. These exercises are short, replicable, and scalable across contexts, providing concrete tools for anyone wanting to embody the Gita's teachings in practical ways. Over months, these small habits compound into a life orientation that balances vigorous engagement with inner freedom. When balancing engagement with detachment, a common fear arises that compassion might be lost or that effort will slacken, and the Gita addresses this possible misreading directly. Authentic detachment actually sharpens compassion because it prevents emotional overwhelm and preserves the capacity to help others over time. Rather than burning out after one dramatic effort, detachment thus becomes a resource for sustained altruism and strategic care instead of an obstacle to feeling. Learning to hold both involvement and spaciousness simultaneously requires disciplined practice and moral clarity, but the payoff is significant. Sustained service that remains effective and humane. This dual capacity is precisely what the Gita cultivates through its mixture of metaphysics, ethics, and discipline. Across cultures and epochs, the Gita has been read as a handbook for courageous, detached action, influencing warriors, politicians, and contemplatives alike, and its cross-temporal appeal invites careful examination. Its wisdom translates into modern leadership frameworks that emphasize mission-driven work, emotional regulation, and responsible decision-making. Leaders who adopt these principles tend to sustain focus under pressure, make ethically grounded choices, and mobilize teams without collapsing into ego. Driven micromanagement. The Gita's synthesis of action and renunciation offers a rare combination of practical utility and spiritual depth, making it uniquely useful for anyone who must act in uncertain, morally complex environments. Its lessons remain timely precisely because human dilemmas about duty, desire, and consequence persist across time. To internalize the Gita, practically start with small experiments that test the separation between effort and attachment in low-stakes settings before scaling to higher-stakes arenas. Try choosing a task to do today purely for its rightness rather than its reward. Then observe your mental state before and after without judgment. Record what changes when you prioritize duty over outcome, paying attention to stress levels, clarity, and interpersonal effects. These simple experimental steps produce qualitative data about how detached engagement works in your life and reveal where habitual attachment still pulls strings. Over weeks, the pattern of detachment becomes accessible, measurable, and integrated into daily practice rather than remaining an abstract ideal. Sometimes detachment feels like a paradoxical freedom because it lets people act more boldly without fear of personal annihilation. And this paradox is a central gift of the Gita. When the self is not constantly endangered by outcomes, risk becomes calculable and courage becomes sustainable rather than theatrical. This freedom to act without existential stakes empowers long-term projects, ethical choices, and compassionate service that would be impossible under constant fear of loss. The Gita teaches that true courage is not blind bravado, but steadiness of purpose informed by discernment and love. And this kind of courage builds lives of meaning rather than mere spectacle. In that sense, acting without attachment becomes both a personal liberation and a contribution to the collective good. The philosophical twist of the Gita is that freedom arises not from withdrawing from life, but from engaging responsibly without being owned by results. And this counterintuitive insight reshapes how we view success. Liberation arrives through the disciplined act of letting go, not through inaction or resignation, turning work into worship and effort into offering. This redefinition elevates ordinary labor to a spiritual practice and democratizes the possibility of inner freedom for anyone willing to learn. As the video closes, remember that the battlefield of life persists and the choice to act with detachment remains available to everyone regardless of context. If this perspective resonated and gave you a new way to approach difficult work, hit subscribe to explore more ideas that blend ancient wisdom with modern life.